A masterpiece of Soviet engineering weighing 640 tons, capable of lifting an entire train into the air, survived the collapse of a superpower that perished in the fire of the February 2022 events. A225 Mriya, the largest aircraft in history, which became a symbol of the triumph of human thought and the greatest aviation tragedy. Why did designers need to build a giant with a wingspan of almost 90 meters? And how did this carrier of space shuttles become the savior of the planet in the midst of a pandemic? What technical secrets allowed it to lift loads that everyone else refused? And is it realistic to resurrect the legend using the second unfinished fuselage, gathering dust at the factory since the 90s? Watch the video to the end. Today we will analyze the phenomenon of the An-225, its tragic end in Hostomel, and find out if a new dream will fly. Let's begin. On October 16, 1986, at the Oleg Antonov Design Bureau in Kiev, a document on several sheets of paper is approved. Technical requirements. A dry formulation for what in 2 years would become one of the most daring engineering solutions of the 20th century. The formulation of the task sounds almost ordinary. A transport plane is needed, capable of carrying by air the reusable space shuttle Buran, together with elements of the Mriya launch vehicle. The mass of the cargo is over 60 tons. It's not even about the weight, it's about the shape. Buran looks like a plane without wings, but with a wide sloping body. It cannot be hidden inside the cargo compartment. It is too large and has too inconvenient a geometry for any existing fuselage. This means it will have to be carried not inside, but on top, like a backpack on a back. The railway does not take such cargo. The dimensions do not pass into a single tunnel along the route. Road transport will stretch for weeks and require dismantling bridges and power lines along the route. The space program has neither weeks nor extra bridges. One option remains: air. The Soviet Union in these years is competing with the United States not for territory and not for resources, but for the right to be the first to prove that it is capable of more. Space is the main showcase of this rivalry. To be late with the transport of Buran means to lose not a logistical task, but a part of this showcase in front of the eyes of the entire planet. Viktor Tolmachov is appointed project manager. Time is catastrophically short. Usually it takes 7 to 8 years to develop an aircraft of this scale. The design bureau has 3.5. The only way to meet such a deadline is not to start from scratch. As a basis, they take the already existing heavy transport aircraft An-124 Ruslan, its fuselage, part of the systems, the proven wing design. But even with such support, the engineers face a task that is easier to solve on paper than in metal. Stretch the fuselage, strengthen the structure, add 2 additional engines to the 4 already existing. Replace the single-fin tail assembly with a twin-fin one, because the old one simply cannot cope with the new aerodynamics. One of the engineers, looking at the fresh sketch of the tail section, asked without much confidence, "Will it even fly?" "It must," they answered him. "We have no right to any other answer." The drawings are redesigned almost daily. Designers work in 3 shifts because the schedule leaves no pauses. Only a few people know about the existence of the project. The tests are conducted under conditions of strict secrecy, and the final result is not guaranteed in advance by anyone, even the creators of the machine themselves. By December 1988, an aircraft is rolled out of the assembly shop, which is not yet a single hour of flight time and not a single practically confirmed figure. There are only calculations, 3.5 years of work, and a cargo weighing 60 tons, which this machine has to lift into the air first in the history of aviation. But before talking about how this was achieved, it is worth seeing what exactly the engineers were dealing with. And the figures here are such that it is difficult to believe in them, even looking at the plane itself live. The fuselage length of the An-225 is 84 meters. If you lay a 9-story residential building on its side, the plane will still turn out to be longer. And we are talking only about the body, without taking into account the wingspan. And the wingspan is 88 meters and 40 centimeters. This figure still remains an absolute record in the history of aviation. Not a single aircraft built after the An-225, including modern passenger airliners, has been able to surpass it. A fully loaded Mriya weighs 640 tons. To make it clearer what we are talking about, This is the mass of 7 passenger Boeings of the 737 model, fully fueled, if they could be lifted into the air in one body. Of these 640 tons, up to 250 can fall on the cargo itself. More than 4 diesel locomotives coupled together weigh, or 10 railway cars filled to the top with coal. 6 D-18T turbofan engines lift all this. Each develops a thrust of about 24 tons. Take 6 such engines, imagine them not under the wing but separately, and you get a thrust comparable to an entire train accelerated to the limit. At the same time, the cruising speed of the plane is 800 kilometers per hour. It seems illogical, such a huge machine, but flies faster than most long-distance trains and many cargo trucks on the highway. But that is exactly how it is. With a cargo of 200 tons, the An-225 is capable of flying about 4,000 kilometers without a single refueling. This is enough to cross an entire continent, from one ocean to another. The landing gear consists of 32 wheels. This is not for effect. This is about the fact that the weight of such a machine must be evenly distributed over the concrete of the runway. Otherwise, the runway simply will not withstand this load. The crew consists of 6 people. In long flights that stretch for dozens of hours, a small kitchen, a shower cabin, and sleeping places are provided for them. A logical question arises. Why does a cargo plane need a shower at all? The answer is simple. The flight can take more than a day, and putting an exhausted pilot at the controls of a multi-ton machine during the landing approach is no longer about comfort, but about safety. Each of these figures individually is impressive, but they really start to work together only in one case, when the machine leaves the ground for the first time. And this happened in an environment that almost no one knew about in advance. On December 3rd and 4th, 1988, at the airfield near Kiev, the aircraft is tested for the first time on the run. Not in the air, so far only on the ground. Taxiing, turns, short runs with acceleration to 200 kilometers per hour, and lifting of the nose landing gear. Each check is, in essence, a question without the right to make a mistake. Will 6 engines withstand the simultaneous load? Will a machine of such mass respond to rudder control as predicted by calculations? Will something in the structure diverge, where engineers calculated the margin of safety literally on paper, without a single hour of real flight time? All checks pass cleanly. The date of the first flight is set for December 20th. And here the weather intervenes. Low clouds, snow squalls. The flight service decides to postpone the flight for a day. For a team that worked for 3.5 years without a right to delay, an extra day of waiting turns out to be almost more painful than the flight itself. On December 21st, the sky remains almost as inhospitable. The clouds are low, the snow either starts or stops. But the weather conditions are within acceptable limits, and the decision is made. We fly today. The airfield looks empty on this day. Neither a crowd of spectators nor journalists with cameras. Only those who are supposed to be there by duty, and a few people for whom what is happening means much more than just a work shift. The test pilot, Alexander Galinenko, is appointed commander of the crew. Beside him are a co-pilot, a navigator, 2 flight engineers, a radio operator, and a leading flight test engineer. 7 people who have to lift into the air for the first time in history, a machine that before that existed only in calculations and on the slipways of the assembly shop. Before the start, someone from the technical service throws a short phrase, nothing special, an ordinary saying before the flight. Well, with God. With God, Galinenko answers, not taking his eyes off the instrument panel. 6 turbines start one after another. The hum grows in waves, first dull, then sharp, metallic, such that the ground under the feet of the technicians at the parking lot vibrates barely noticeably. The machine starts to move, running start, and at some point, closer to the middle of the strip, 84 meters of fuselage and 88 meters of wing detach from the concrete, smoothly, without a jerk, as if the plane had done this 1,000 times already. In the air, the crew works according to the standard program of the first flight, checking stability, reaction to control deflection, system behavior in different modes. Nothing spectacular from the outside, but for 7 people in the cockpit, perhaps the most tense hour of their professional lives. The flight ends closer to lunch. The indicators coincide with the calculated ones almost without deviations, a rare case for a machine of such scale that rose into the sky for the first time. Not a single newspaper will write about the fact of the flight that evening. The secrecy around the project will be removed only in a few weeks. But for those who stood that day at the airfield under the low December sky, it was already obvious. The machine flies. The question that remained open sounded different. What is it capable of if it is loaded for real? After the December flight, the aircraft spends another 3 months in a regular program of flight tests. But the crew and the designers have had another goal in mind for a long time. Not just to prove that the machine flies, but to register this officially, at the level of world achievements. On March 22, 1989, Mriya is prepared for a flight with maximum load. A ballast with a total mass of 156.3 tons is loaded on board, a weight comparable to the mass of about 130 passenger cars placed inside one fuselage. Observers from the International Aeronautical Federation are present officially this time. Their task is to record every flight parameter with an accuracy that will then lie in the protocol and get into the register of world records. The takeoff is heavier than the December one. The mass of the aircraft at this moment exceeds 500 tons. The run is longer, speed is gained slower, and yet the machine again detaches from the strip normally, without deviations from the calculated trajectory. In the air, the crew methodically follows the set route, a closed circle with a length of 2,000 kilometers. With this cargo, the plane develops a speed of 815.9 kilometers per hour. It rises to an altitude of 12,430 meters, a rare indicator even for machines without cargo, let alone a plane carrying 156 tons of ballast. And the total mass of the machine at an altitude of 2,000 meters is recorded in the protocol as 508,200 kilograms. One flight, 3 hours and 45 minutes in the air, and 110 recorded world records at the same time. Because every combination of parameters, speed at a certain distance with a certain cargo, altitude with the same cargo, total mass at a specific level, is counted as a separate achievement. On the ground, in the control room, someone from the Federation's observers, checking the figures with the protocol, says out loud what was clearly on everyone's tongue. Such an amount in one sortie? I have not seen this before. No one present that day formulated this out loud, but in essence what happened was this. In one flight, Mriya entered the history of aviation at once by dozens of indicators, part of which has not been surpassed to this day, decades after the appearance of much more modern aircraft. Then, in March 1989, not a single person at the airfield thought about the fact that these records would outlive not only the competitors, but also the plane itself that set them. For now, it was not about the future, but about the very next task, the one for the sake of which the machine was built from the very beginning. All previous months, the aircraft flew light, or with a regular ballast. But the task for the sake of which it was built was waiting for its hour only now, in the spring of 1989, at the airfield next to the Baikonur Cosmodrome. On May 3rd, mechanics for the first time secure on the back of Mriya a real cargo, the reusable space shuttle Buran, weighing more than 60 tons. Not an imitation, not a model for working out the alignment. The very shuttle that a few months before had already flown into space and returned to Earth in automatic mode without a single person on board. The first joint flight is short and cautious. The crew checks how the combination behaves in the air, whether it is stable at different speeds, how much fuel is consumed with such a cargo on the fuselage. The answer is no less important than the fact of takeoff itself. One thing is to lift the ballast into the air, evenly distributed inside the fuselage, and quite another is a huge ship with its own aerodynamics secured outside on the back. For 10 days, the crew under the command of Alexander Galinenko lifts this combination into the sky time after time, taking readings and refining calculations. And only on May 13th is the decision made. It is time to perform the flight for the sake of which all this was started from the very beginning, to transfer Buran under its own power to the airfield in Kyiv, 2,700 kilometers away. The takeoff mass of the aircraft on this day is 560 tons, more than 500,000 kilograms if you count literally. The crew lifts the machine into the air and takes course without a single intermediate landing. What happens in the cockpit in such hours? From the outside, nothing dramatic. Instruments, navigators' reports, calculation of the remaining fuel. But behind this routine stands a simple fact. Under the fuselage, there is not a single reserve airfield on the entire route, where such a combination could land in case of an emergency. If something goes wrong in the middle of the way, the crew will not have the option of landing nearby. Everything passes normally. 4 hours and 25 minutes in the air, and the plane with the shuttle on its back lands in Kyiv. 2,700 kilometers behind, without a single refueling, without a single technical stop. At the airfield, those meeting raise their heads long before the machine appears in sight. First, a hum is heard, heavy and low, as if a freight train is going far away. Then a silhouette appears on the horizon, which is difficult to confuse with anything. A wide fuselage, and above it a second, smoother and more streamlined shape of the ship. For the designers who spent 3.5 years on drawings and calculations, this moment means more than all the previous records combined. The task set back in 1986 is finally completed, not on paper, but in the air. But to show this to each other is one thing. To show this to the whole world is quite another. And exactly this was to happen in a month on another continent. In June 1989, the 38th International Air Show in Le Bourget near Paris is held. The organizers are preparing a regular program: static expositions, demonstration flights, presentations of new models. None of the arrangers yet knows that exactly this will eclipse everything else at this exhibition. Mriya, with Buran on its back, lands right in front of the eyes of the gathered public. The perspective is unusual so much that part of the spectators in the stands in the first seconds do not even understand what exactly they are looking at. Too big a machine, too strange a silhouette for the usual ideas about how a plane should look. The hum of 6 engines on approach is felt almost physically. It is heard, and they feel the vibration long before the machine is over the strip. And when it finally stops at the parking lot, a crowd gathers around it in a matter of minutes, denser than at any other exhibit of the salon. Western specialists, who before this had seen Soviet developments mainly in low-quality photographs, for the first time get the opportunity to go around the machine from all sides, to evaluate the scale live. For many, the reaction is about the same: disbelief, and then recognition of the fact that in front of them is not a propaganda model, but a completely real, flying engineering object. One of the French journalists who covered the salon later recalled the moment at the gangway with a short observation, approximately in the spirit that the entire salon on this day seemed to rebuild itself around one point on the flight field. For several days of shows, Mriya, with Buran, managed to be filmed for dozens of publications around the world. Photographs of this combination diverge in newspapers from Paris to Tokyo. For most readers, this is the first acquaintance with the plane, about the existence of which 6 months ago no one outside a narrow circle of specialists even suspected. Upon completion of the salon, the crew lifts the machine on a return course, with an intermediate landing in Prague, and in early July returns to the airfield near Baikonur, to the same place from where everything started a few months ago. Here it is worth pausing on one detail that is easily missed behind all this triumph. While in Paris, hundreds of thousands of people applauded Soviet engineering, inside the country that built this plane, things were going not so smoothly as they looked from the outside. The economy stalled. The shortage of goods was felt increasingly acutely. The political system, only recently seeming unshakable, began to crack at the seams much faster than anyone was ready to admit out loud. Mriya at this moment was at the peak of fame, and in less than 2 years, everything for the sake of which it was created would be called into question. While Mriya was gathering applause at European air shows, the country that built it was changing faster than anyone had time to realize. In 1990, work on the Energia Buran program is suspended, officially due to lack of funding, unofficially because the state has no time for space. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Only yesterday, a single country breaks up into 15 independent states. And in this restructuring of borders, economies, and priorities, the space program, for the sake of which the largest plane in the world was built, turns out to be far from the first in the list of what needs to be saved. On May 25, 1993, the Council of Chief Designers at the Scientific Production Association, Energia, makes an official decision. The program is closed, finally. By this moment, 5 ships of the Buran series are ready or are in varying degrees of construction. Not one of them will ever fly again. Think for a second what this meant for the designers who, with 3.5 years of intense work, created a machine for one single task, and in one day this task ceased to exist. Not gradually, not through long years of negotiations. The decision was signed, and everything for the sake of which Mriya was built lost its meaning overnight. The plane by this moment had completed only a few dozen flights. It has behind it world records, international recognition, visibility that any passenger liner would envy, and at the same time, not a single remaining task for which it was originally designed. The construction of the second copy, which was to become the partner of the first, stops in the middle. The fuselage and wing by this moment are already ready by about 2/3, but there is no one left to finish it and nothing to finish it on. The plants that supplied the components turned out to be in different countries, separated by new borders and different currencies. At the airfield near Kyiv, the first copy of Mriya continues to be formally listed in the flight list. But flights are becoming increasingly rare, and the question of what to do with a plane that has nothing more to carry is becoming increasingly acute. The symbol of the technological triumph of an entire era turns out to be in a position about which the engineers who drew its contours in 1986 thought least of all. The machine stands idle, and the country that could find a use for it is occupied with much more pressing problems of its own survival. Already in the next year, the management will make a decision that for years will determine the fate of the plane, and this decision will turn out to be much more prosaic than any records. In 1994, the engines are removed from the aircraft, not for repair, to put them on another machine, the transport An-124 Ruslan, which at that moment has something to do, unlike Mriya. The decision is purely practical. Why let 6 operational turbines stand idle if they can be used where they will bring benefit right now? For a plane that less than 5 years ago gathered crowds of spectators at the largest air shows on the planet, this is virtually the end of its flight career. Without engines, the machine turns into a stationary body, huge, recognizable, but absolutely helpless. Mriya is rolled into the hangar at the airfield near Kyiv. The light inside is rare, duty only, turns on except for planned rounds. Dust settles on the fuselage in layers that no one is in a hurry to wipe. What is the point of bringing shine to a machine that does not have a single planned departure? The humidity of Ukrainian winters and summers does its work slowly but surely. On separate metal elements, rust appears, not critical, but noticeable to someone who knows what a serviceable aviation technician should look like. Periodically, someone from the former crew members or engineers who worked on the project goes into the hangar just to look. Not by duty necessity, rather from a feeling that to leave the machine completely without attention would be wrong. What is it like, day after day, to pass by the largest plane in the world, knowing that formally it is listed in the flight list, and actually turned into the most expensive museum exhibit in the history of aviation under the open sky? The answer to this question is known to few, those who in these years continue to be listed as assigned to the machine, for which, it seemed, there was no future. The economic situation in the country in the mid-90s does not leave room for sentimentality. There are far more urgent expenditures than returning to service a giant transport plane without operating engines and without a clear commercial purpose. Thus passes almost 6 years. Mriya remains in limbo, not written off enough to officially disappear from the register, and not needed enough for someone to hurry to return it to the sky. The turning point comes not thanks to nostalgia and not thanks to a state program. It comes thanks to a much more down-to-earth reason, the demand that by the end of the 90s begins to form in the market, where such a plane, as it turns out, can still be useful. By the late 90s, the airline operating the fleet of An-124 Ruslan transport aircraft was starting to accumulate a list of orders that it physically could not perform. Customers needed to carry cargoes heavier and larger than what Ruslan was capable of lifting. Generators of power plants, large capacity industrial equipment, separate sections for construction projects. The company, meanwhile, had in the hangar near Kyiv a machine capable of lifting almost twice as much cargo as any active plane in its fleet. The only difference was that this machine had been standing without engines for several years, and without a single certificate allowing for commercial flights. In 2000, the management makes a decision to restore. Not for the sake of history, and not for the sake of records, for the sake of specific money that can be earned on transportations unavailable to anyone else in the world. The company, Motorsich, a manufacturer of aircraft engines, together with the design bureau, invests about $20 million in the project. The sum by the standards of a giant transport plane is modest, but it is enough to bring the machine back to life. The works go on for almost a year. Engines are returned to the plane, new systems for preventing collisions in the air are installed, modern radio stations, sound-absorbing structures on the engine compartments. Without this, the machine simply would not be able to correspond to the requirements by which civil planes fly around the world today. On May 7, 2001, 7 years after the engines were removed from Mriya, the plane again rises into the air from the airfield near Kyiv. The flight is short, the program is modest. The main task is not to beat records, but simply to confirm that the machine is still capable of flying. One of the technicians who observed the takeoff later recalled a short phrase thrown by someone nearby at the parking lot. "Well, the old lady has flown." "Not an old lady," they corrected him. "She is only 12 years old. Just rested a little longer than planned." During the next weeks, the plane passes a series of certification flights. On May 23, 2001, the aviation regulatory authorities issue Mriya a type certificate, a document officially permitting commercial transportations. And here begins the most unexpected. The plane, designed for the sake of carrying the space shuttle into space, returns to the sky not at all for the sake of science. It returns for a task much more prosaic, to carry generators, transformers, and industrial equipment for customers who have nowhere else to turn. Exactly this ordinary work, and not the records of the 90s, will very soon make Mriya truly irreplaceable. The first truly commercial flight of Mriya is performed in 2002. From this moment, she ceases to be an exhibition exhibit and becomes a working horse, even if such as does not exist in any company of the world. The orders that Mriya receives are united by one thing: they cannot be performed by anyone except her. Locomotives, quarry dump trucks, industrial generators, turbines of power plants, cargo so heavy or of such inconvenient shape that for them there simply does not exist an alternative way of delivery, except by land, with the dismantling of bridges and power lines along the entire route. In 2009, the plane receives an order that will enter the history of cargo transportation. From Germany to Armenia, it is necessary to deliver a turbo generator for a new thermal power plant in Yerevan, weighing about 190 tons. For comparison, this is heavier than 120 passenger cars placed on top of each other in one cargo. The cargo is secured outside, on the upper part of the fuselage, in the same place where the space shuttle Buran once held. The only difference is that instead of the orbital shuttle, there is now a power plant turbine, and instead of a test site, a regular commercial flight with a specific customer and a specific delivery time. For this transportation, Mriya receives a certificate of the Guinness Book of Records. By that moment, on the account of the plane already was listed the absolute record of carrying capacity, 253.8 tons in one indivisible cargo, a figure that to this day has not been surpassed by any other aircraft in the history of aviation. In the summer of 2010, the order turns out to be unusual for another reason, not by weight, but by length. 2 blades of a wind generator, each 42 meters and 10 centimeters long, must be carried by air. For comparison, this is longer than a football field from one penalty area to another. How to secure inside the fuselage a cargo longer than the fuselage itself by at least half? The answer is solved in an engineering way. The blades are placed diagonally, with a partial projection, carefully calculating the alignment. The cargo enters history as the most long-sized ever carried by air. And in May 2016, Mriya performs one of the most long-range flights by geography in its entire career, the delivery of a 100-ton-plus generator to Perth, Australia. The route stretches for more than 15,500 kilometers, with intermediate landings in the Czech Republic, Turkmenistan, India, and Malaysia. One of the company's engineers, commenting on this transportation to journalists, noted quite simply, "We do not sell people a plane. We sell them the only solution to a problem that no one else can solve." This phrase, more accurately than any records, explains why customers for years were ready to wait in line for Mriya, even knowing that the rent of one flight hour cost tens of thousands of dollars. But the most significant flight in the history of the plane was waiting for it not in the queue of commercial orders, but in a completely different, much more alarming reality, the one that hit the whole world in early 2020. In the spring of 2020, a new coronavirus, COVID-19, spreads across the planet. Borders are closed one after another. air traffic between countries almost stops, and hospitals around the world face an acute shortage of protective equipment, masks, tests, personal protective equipment. In this situation, Mriya unexpectedly has a new, much more important task than the transportation of turbines and generators. On April 13, 2020, the plane departs from the Chinese city of Tianjin, where about 100 tons of medical cargo are loaded on board, tests for laboratory diagnostics, protective masks, and other equipment, with a total volume of about 1,000 cubic meters. For comparison, such a volume of cargo inside one plane had never been carried before in the history of aviation. With refueling in Kazakhstan, the plane takes course to Warsaw. About the flight by this moment already know not only specialists, the news diverges on social networks, and about 80,000 people follow the approach of the plane to the Polish capital in real time. Landing at the Chopin airport, the crew does what is usually expected of a cargo flight by no one. The plane passes at a low altitude right over the strip, without releasing the landing gear, slightly rocks its wings, a gesture that with pilots traditionally means greeting, and only after that goes on a second circle for a full landing. For thousands of people who watch this at the screens in the midst of one of the most alarming springs in their memory, this simple rocking of the wings means much more than just the maneuver before the approach. This is the only way available to them at that moment to see something encouraging happening right now in real time. In a few days, Mriya repeats such a flight, this time to the Paris Vatry airport, again with a cargo of the same record volume. And on April 23rd, the plane delivers a humanitarian cargo weighing 103 tons already to the homeland, to Kyiv. Millions of protective masks, hundreds of thousands of sets of personal protective equipment, and protective goggles for local medical workers. The president of Ukraine personally comments on this flight, calling it one of the most significant cargoes that the country has ever accepted, and noting that by the volume of delivered, it can well claim the next entry in the Book of World Records. Needless to say, for a plane designed half a century ago for the sake of the space program, and then barely written off in the mid-90s, such a role turns out to be unexpected twice? Mriya was never conceived as a symbol of salvation, and nevertheless, exactly this spring, she becomes a symbol of exactly this, and not for one country, but for several continents at the same time. Exactly after these flights happens what was difficult to predict even for the creators of the plane. Mriya begins to be recognized not only by aviation specialists, but literally by everyone, from children drawing her in notebooks to people who had never before been interested in technology at all. By the end of the 2000s, Mriya ceases to be just a plane in the eyes of the public. She becomes something like a living celebrity, rare, recognizable at first glance, and causing interest in people who at other times are completely indifferent to aviation. Over the years of operation, on the account of the plane already was listed about 240 officially registered world records, by carrying capacity, by the length of the carried cargo, by the range of individual routes. Not a single other aircraft in the history of civil aviation approached such a quantity at the same time. But far more curious is another, less obvious detail. By the middle of the tens on the online flight tracking services, which are used by both professionals and ordinary aviation lovers, Mriya stably turns out to be one of the most tracked boards in the world, given that the vast majority of her flights were performed not for passengers, but exclusively for cargo transportation. Were the plane to rise into the air at any point of the globe, as thousands of people begin to follow her icon on the map at the same time, just to see where this time the largest plane of the planet is flying and with what cargo. Think, do you know many cargo planes for the flight of which people follow for entertainment as for a football match? Mriya, perhaps the only such case in the history of commercial aviation. In parallel, more traditional popularity also grows. Models of the plane in different scales become one of the most sold in the category of heavy transport and cargo aviation among collectors around the world. Documentaries are filmed about the plane for major international TV channels dedicated to science and technology. Its history is analyzed in training materials on engineering as an example of what happens when designers are set a task at the limit of the technical capabilities of the era. On children's drawings that are sent to the design bureau by school children from all over the world, Mriya appears regularly, along with more familiar heroes like space rockets and superheroes from cartoons. For an entire generation of people, born already after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this plane has become one of the few symbols that is associated not with politics and not with the past, but with pure engineering admiration. There is a logic in the fact that a working machine, and not an exhibition exhibit, becomes a symbol. Mriya did not stand for years under the glass of a museum. She regularly rose into the air, carried real cargoes, landed at real airfields in dozens of countries. People could see her live, not in a closed exposition, but at a local cargo terminal. And from this, the attachment to the plane only became stronger. The more famous and beloved this symbol became, the harder it would be to accept the news of what happened to it next. And yet, exactly this news in less than 2 years will fly around the world. On February 5, 2022, Mriya is rolled into the hangar of the Antonov airfield in Hostomel for a planned engine repair. An ordinary procedure of those that happened during 20 years of commercial operation of the plane dozens of times. No one at this moment could know that exactly this repair would be the last. On February 24, 2022, the full-scale events of February began. The Hostomel airfield, with its long runway just a few dozen kilometers from Kyiv, almost immediately turns out to be in the center of active clashes. The landing operation in the first hours is directed precisely at the capture of this object. On that day, the attack is managed to be repulsed. But the airfield remains a zone of active encounters, and in this environment, it turns out to be simply impossible to evacuate the plane, disassembled for repair and not capable of rising into the air. Mriya stands in the hangar, stationary, defenseless before what is happening around her. On February 27, 2022, the engagements for the airfield resume with a new force. At some point, the hangar building where the plane is located is engulfed in fire. By the evening of the same day, the Ukrainian side officially confirms, Mriya is destroyed. The exact circumstances of that day will still be the subject of investigations and proceedings for a long time. In subsequent months and years, different sources describe the details of what happened in the hangar in different ways. But the final result, which the whole world learns that evening, does not cause disagreement. The only flight specimen of the plane, which rose into the sky 33 years ago near Kyiv, no longer exists. Photographs of the charred fuselage protruding from under the collapsed roof of the hangar in a matter of hours fly around all major news publications of the planet. People who had never before been interested in aviation suddenly find that this news touches them personally, approximately in the same way as the news of the loss of something familiar from childhood touches, even if you had never seen this thing live. One of the pilots who flew Mriya for many years records a short address in which he with difficulty selects words. I do not know how to explain this to those who did not fly on her. This was not just a technology. This was a life's work for several generations of people. For the design bureau that designed the plane back in the 80s, this news means something more than the loss of one machine. This is the loss of the only operating copy of the two once laid down, and with this loss, the future of the entire project hangs under a huge question. But, as it turns out quite soon, this question is not so hopeless as it seemed in the first weeks after the tragedy. Because somewhere in another hangar, much less known to the general public, all this time was waiting for its hour, the second plane. At the Design Bureau's plant near Kyiv, the second copy of Mriya is indeed located all this time. They began to build it back in Soviet years, in parallel with the first plane, and after the closing of the space program, the works were stopped, but not disassembled, but mothballed. According to the estimates of engineers, the fuselage and wing of this machine are ready by about 70%. For 3 decades, she stood in the hangar, waiting for a decision that was never made, neither in the 90s, nor in the 2000s, nor in the 10s. In May 2022, just a few months after the loss of the first plane, the President of Ukraine publicly calls the completion of the second copy one of the priority tasks, not only from a practical point of view, but also as a kind of memory sign for everyone who had ever been connected with this project. However, immediately it turns out that the question rests not on desire, but on much more down-to-earth things, money and time. Official estimates that sounded from the Ukrainian side in the first months after the loss called a sum of more than $3 billion in a period of several years. Later, and apparently more realistic calculations that appeared already in subsequent years, speak of sums significantly more modest, about $500 million, if we limit ourselves to the completion of the existing body, without ambitions to repeat the whole path of the first Mriya from scratch. The spread of 6 times between these estimates speaks for itself. There is simply no exact price for such a project until the works are started seriously. Too many variables, from who exactly will undertake to finance the restoration, to what systems they decide to update and which ones to leave in the original form. As of the middle of the 26th year, reports appear that work on the second copy is indeed being carried out, so far without extra publicity, at one of the profile enterprises. There is still no official confirmation of the completion dates, and it would be premature to call the exact date when, and whether it will happen at all, the new Mriya will be able to rise into the sky. What can be said for sure already now is that the interest in this machine does not fade, despite all the years of uncertainty. At aviation exhibitions, children continue to look at the scale models of the plane with the same delight as a quarter of a century ago. Engineers around the world continue to refer to Mriya as an example of what a team can do that has almost no resources, but has 3.5 years and absolute confidence in their own calculations. The history of Mriya is a story of how one plane managed to live several different lives in 33 years. First, an instrument of political and technological rivalry of superpowers. Then, a forgotten giant, idling in the hangar without application. Then, a working horse of world cargo aviation. And finally, a symbol that in the most alarming months of the spring of 2020, for a few minutes, united at the screens people on several continents at the same time. All these lives ended on one February evening in 2022. But if you believe those who today are working on the second copy, somewhere in a closed shop near Kyiv, this story, perhaps, has not yet put its last point.